Can a single flower really cost more than a house? More than a mansion? More than a ship full of treasure? In the 1600s, one delicate bloom nearly brought an entire economy to its knees. This is the wild story of Tulip Mania, the world's first financial bubble. And in the final part, you'll discover the exact tulip that sold for what would now be over $1 million. And how the crash that followed changed the world of money forever. But before we dive in, let me know if you're enjoying this kind of history. Tap that like button and subscribe, only if you truly love what I'm doing here. Part 1. Seeds of Madness: How Tulips Took Over Europe. It was winter in the Dutch Republic. The year was 1602, and the North Sea winds howled through the ports of Amsterdam. Among the crates of silk, spices, and foreign timber was something small, unassuming, and unlike anything the locals had ever seen. A handful of strange bulbs, round, earthy, dormant, sat tucked in a shipment from the east. They weren't gold or silver. They weren't even edible. But those little bulbs carried a secret. In spring, they would erupt into colors the Dutch had never imagined. Deep crimson, royal purple, striped ivory, blazing orange. Some looked like fire frozen into petals. One merchant knelt in awe before a violet bloom edged in flame. This wasn't just a flower. It was art, beauty, and mystery in one stem. And it had arrived at the perfect time. The Dutch were rising, and so was their hunger for wealth, for wonder, and for something rare enough to prove they had both. Tulips didn't grow wild in the Netherlands. They came from far away, from the sun-drenched gardens of the Ottoman Empire, where sultans once gazed upon them in private courtyards. Their origin gave them mystique, an exotic presence no local plant could rival. Early on, tulips were a collector's prize. Only nobles and scientists cultivated them, trading bulbs like rare coins or artifacts. Each variety had a name, a lineage, a price. The petals bloomed for just a few short weeks each year. Their beauty was fleeting, their bloom unpredictable, and yet this only made them more prized. In a culture where permanence was tied to status, tulips were rebellion in bloom, temporary, fragile, untouchable. At first, they were grown in secrecy behind palace walls and academic greenhouses. But word spread. A flower so captivating could not remain hidden for long. Whispers turned to want. And by the time the merchant class took notice, tulips were no longer just plants. They were prestige. The Dutch were not royalty, but they were rich. Trade had turned the once humble province into a powerhouse of ships, spices, and gold. A new class was rising: merchants, craftsmen, lawyers, people who had money but lacked nobility. They didn't want titles. They wanted symbols, something to show the world they had made it. And in tulips, they found their perfect badge. Unlike paintings or jewelry, tulips lived. They bloomed, faded, and returned. They required care. They made a statement without a word. Gardens in Amsterdam became outdoor galleries. The more rare your bulbs, the more heads turned. Some began collecting obsessively, treating their flower beds like investment portfolios. Wealth wasn't just displayed inside anymore, it was planted, labeled, and cataloged in the soil. Bulbs passed between merchants like heirlooms, tucked into letters and exchanged beneath dinner tables. As demand grew, a question quietly surfaced in the minds of many. What if tulips weren't just beautiful? What if they could make you rich? And then came the broken ones. Not broken as in ruined, but broken in color. Some tulips bloomed with streaks and flames, wildly striped in unexpected shades. No one knew it then, but these were caused by a virus, one that altered pigmentation and made each bloom one of a kind. People were stunned. A flower that looked like marble? One that flared like candlelight? These weren't just flowers. They were living art, unpredictable and utterly unreplicable. A single broken bulb could fetch a small fortune. Collectors named them, cataloged them, and fought over ownership. Some were kept under lock and key until bloom season. The mystique only deepened. These weren't flowers anymore. They were treasure. And like any treasure, people started wondering how to trade them. Not just to own them, but to turn them into more. More bulbs, more money, more status, more of everything. And so, tulips quietly slipped out of the garden and into the marketplace. First, it was simple. A man might trade one rare bulb for a cart of wheat or a barrel of beer. But the numbers started climbing. A baker offered up his entire stock for one promised delivery. A cobbler traded several pairs of shoes, a coat, and a pig. Taverns became makeshift exchanges, where men passed around sketches of tulips on scrap paper. They weren't even handling the bulbs anymore, just agreements, promises, a slip of parchment that said, "This bulb will be yours in spring." The flower didn't matter. The bloom didn't matter. Only the deal. Word spread that one rare bulb had changed hands for 12 fat sheep, for oxen, and enough wine to drown a wedding. But no one laughed. No one blinked, because they all thought the same thing. If I don't buy now, someone else will. And this was only the beginning, the craziest trade. That was still ahead. Part 2. The blooming madness when tulips became currency. The flower had become a fever. In smoky taverns and candlelit back rooms, men no longer talked about bloom times or petal shape. They talked numbers, contracts, returns. The tulip had left the garden behind. What mattered now wasn't the flower itself, but the paper promise attached to it. Futures were born, an agreement that a certain bulb would be delivered in a few months, though no one cared to wait. They just sold the contract to someone else, and then someone else, each buyer convinced they could offload it at a higher price. Buyers no longer asked what the tulip looked like. They didn't even care if it ever bloomed. They only asked one thing: how much more can I get for it tomorrow? The market buzzed with energy. Names of rare tulips were spoken like spells. Admiral Van Enquisen, General Bowl, Viceroy, Semper Augustus. Paper passed from hand to hand, getting more expensive with every exchange. A flower had become pure money. It was no longer just merchants or collectors. The mania seeped into every layer of Dutch society. Chimney sweeps borrowed money to buy a bulb they would never touch. Barbers pooled funds with butchers to buy half a contract. Teachers sold off furniture to enter the game. The promise of overnight wealth was too loud to ignore. Some people doubled their money in a day, others tenfold in a week. The streets echoed with stories of a baker who bought a bulb and retired the next month, of a widow who exchanged 2 tulips and bought an estate. The truth behind these tales didn't matter. What mattered was the dream. Fear of missing out gripped the nation. Even those who once mocked the madness found themselves asking, what if I just buy one? Just one bulb, just one chance. The line between gambler and genius blurred. Every tavern table became a stock exchange. Every neighbor became a broker, and no one wanted to be left behind. It got stranger. People began selling bulbs they didn't even own. They signed contracts promising future tulips that hadn't been planted or even bred. And yet, others lined up to buy those contracts too. It became normal. No one asked questions. No one needed to. The price kept climbing. Why worry about the flower when the numbers kept rising? This was no longer botany. This was pure speculation. Reality faded into paper, ink, and belief. And belief, for now, was everywhere. Sketches of tulips were passed around like currency. Some brokers kept detailed illustrations to show what buyers were technically purchasing, though no one seemed to care anymore. The flower had vanished behind its value. All that remained was the rush. The faster you traded, the richer you got. The higher the price, the more people wanted in. Felt unstoppable. And yet, somewhere beneath all the euphoria, the ground had already started to crack. Prices began to stretch the imagination. One artisan, eager to climb the ladder, traded 12 acres of fertile land for a single rare bulb. Another exchanged a team of oxen, his workshop tools, and his daughter's dowry. In Amsterdam, a particularly prized tulip fetched the price of a canal-side townhouse. An absurd leap, even for the most optimistic speculator. But people clapped, not questioned. They called it progress. Value, they said, was simply what someone was willing to pay. And someone always was willing to pay more. But the deliveries stopped. Winter had frozen the soil. No tulips could be dug, planted, or moved. Yet the buying didn't stop. The trading didn't stop. If anything, it sped up, because there was no need for bulbs anymore. Only contracts, only confidence. People mortgaged their homes, pawned their possessions, and borrowed against everything they had, betting that tulips would rise again tomorrow. It was no longer about flowers. It was about faith. And then came the moment no one forgot. In a crowded auction house, deep into the heart of the mania, a bulb was sold for what would today be over $1 million. Its name was Semper Augustus, a flame-streaked marvel, white petals licked with crimson fire. It was already rare, but now it was legend. The buyer paid the modern-day equivalent of a luxury Amsterdam estate. There was no laughter, only applause. The room watched the contract change hands like it had witnessed history. The whispers turned into headlines. A flower had reached 7 digits. And still, people thought this was only the beginning. No one imagined the fall. Not yet, because greed has a funny way of sounding like optimism. And when the climb feels endless, no one dares to look down. They only look up, waiting for the next sale, the next price jump, the next miracle. But the miracle had already happened. Everything after this would begin to wilt. Part 3, Petals Fall, the crash that shook the Dutch economy. Semper Augustus had become more than a tulip. It was legend, myth, and madness, all packed into a bulb the size of a thumb. The day it sold for the equivalent of over $1 million, the crowd didn't gasp. They nodded. Of course it did. This was the most beautiful tulip ever grown. It had streaks like blood on snow, a glow that seemed painted by angels, and a rarity that made it priceless. The buyer, cloaked in wealth, handed over the deed to a luxury townhouse in Amsterdam. Applause followed. In that moment, the market buzzed with confidence. The ceiling, they said, hadn't even been reached yet. Men ordered drinks to celebrate. Brokers inked more contracts. But no one saw the danger in the silence that followed. Because for the first time in months, there was nothing new to report. The price had peaked. And when no one is sure what comes next, hesitation starts to bloom in the cracks. Started small. An auction in Harlem was held, like many before it. A handful of bulbs up for sale, contracts ready to pass. But this time something changed. When the bidding ended, the buyer hesitated, then refused to pay. Laughter filled the room at first. A joke, surely, but then others began to hesitate too. Some delayed payments. Others asked to renegotiate. The illusion began to shiver. The next morning, word spread across town. Buyers were walking away. Confidence began to drip away like melting frost. No one had imagined this could happen, so no one knew what to do. In taverns where contracts had been scribbled over beer, men sat with cold mugs and shaky hands. The belief that had built the entire market started to rot. Prices dropped by the hour. Bulbs that had sold for the price of houses now fetched barely enough to cover a loaf of bread. The great unraveling had begun. The fall was swift and brutal. Buyers vanished. Sellers flooded the streets, desperate to unload their contracts before they became worthless. But there were no takers. Everyone was afraid. Brokers disappeared. Tavern meetings emptied. Bulbs once treated like jewels were tossed aside like rotten onions. Fortunes evaporated overnight. Some contracts were torn in anger. Others were quietly burned. Men who had owned 5, 10, 20 tulip futures suddenly realized they owned nothing at all. No land, no cash. Just promises that had turned to dust. Panic spilled from city to city. Even those who had never touched a tulip were caught in the wave. Markets froze, credit collapsed, businesses failed. Across the country, the question echoed, how could a flower do this? But it wasn't the flower. It was the people, the dream, the madness. And the moment that dream died, the entire house of cards came crashing down. Then came the stories. A baker in Utrecht had mortgaged his entire home to buy a bulb he never even saw. A maid in Harlem had spent her dowry to buy a contract she couldn't read. A schoolteacher had borrowed from friends, family, and students, only to lose it all in a week. Some merchants vanished without a trace, fleeing the cities under cover of night. Others stayed and faced ruin. Courtrooms filled with lawsuits, but the Dutch government refused to enforce the contracts. The tulip trade they ruled had never been real business. It was gambling, speculation, fantasy. And so, thousands were left with nothing but ink-stained paper and empty hands. The public turned bitter. Some mocked the tulip traders as greedy fools. Others pitted them as victims of a delusion too seductive to resist. Either way, the damage was done. The flower that once dazzled Europe had become a symbol of humiliation. Tulip Mania came to an end, but the story never did. It became a warning passed down through generations. A tale of how something so small could stir so much greed, so much hope, and so much devastation. The tulip market never returned to its former heights. The flower remained a part of Dutch life, but never again did it command the price of land or gold. Semper Augustus faded into legend, the million-dollar bloom that marked both the height of desire and the depth of collapse. Historians would later call it the first speculative bubble. Economists would study it. Writers would romanticize it, but at its heart, Tulip Mania was a mirror. It showed what people are willing to believe, how far they'll chase a dream, and what happens when belief runs out. Because in the end, value is never really in the thing itself. Sometimes it's just in the story we tell. And when the story ends, the petals fall.